April 18, 1945. Near the outskirts of Kassel, Germany. The morning mist clung low to the muddy roads, heavy with the scent of diesel and damp pine. The war was nearly over, but the 3rd Armored Division still moved cautiously. Every bend in the road, every farmhouse, could still hide a desperate enemy. Corporal Jack Red Dawson leaned over the hood of a dusty M3 half-track, squinting at the distant tree-line. "You hear that?" he muttered, the faint rumble of an idling engine drifting from beyond a ridge. Lieutenant Frank Miller, their platoon leader, raised a hand for silence. The column halted. The sharp metallic clicks of rifles and machine guns being readied broke through the morning quiet. They advanced slowly, boots sinking into wet earth, until the shape came into view, a massive, 8-ton half-track sitting abandoned beside a blown-out barn. Its long chassis gleamed dully under layers of mud and soot. The front bore the unmistakable Iron Cross, though half-caked with grime. "Holy hell," whispered Private Earl Sanders. "That's a Kraut-heavy tractor, one of those Sd.Kfz 7s, ain't it?" Miller nodded, stepping closer, his gloved hand brushing the cold steel. "That's right. The kind that tows their 88s. Must have been left behind when they ran out of gas." The men gathered around the behemoth. The Sd.Kfz 7 was a sight to behold, long armored fenders, massive tires up front, and steel treads gripping the mud behind. Its Maybach engine sat silent but intimidating under the hood, a mechanical beast built for brute strength rather than speed. Red Dawson climbed up into the driver's seat. The leather was cracked and stiff, but the controls looked surprisingly intact. He grinned down at the others. "Reckon she still runs?" Sanders tossed him a can of captured German fuel they'd found in a nearby shed. "Only one way to find out, Red." Moments later, the air filled with the deep, throaty growl of the Maybach HL-62 engine roaring to life. The entire vehicle trembled, smoke belching from the exhaust. The sound turned heads across the platoon, men stopped in their tracks to watch. "Jesus, listen to that." Dawson laughed, revving it again. "Feels like I'm sitting on a damn Panzer." Miller allowed a rare smile. "Careful with it, Corporal. That thing's worth studying. Could give the intel boys something to chew on." But the excitement was contagious. Soon, a crowd had gathered, cheering as Red slowly rolled the Sd.Kfz 7 forward. It tore deep ruts in the muddy road, its sheer power almost animalistic. "Handles like a dream," Red shouted over the noise. "Beats the hell out of the M3. They didn't know it yet, but the dream machine would soon reveal its dark side. By the time they'd driven a few miles down the winding forest road, the fuel gauge, newly topped off, had already dropped a third. Dawson frowned, tapping it twice. "Must be busted," he said. Miller shook his head. "No, Corporal. I think it's telling you the truth." The men exchanged uneasy glances. The Sd.Kfz 7's thunderous engine roared, but beneath the thrill of driving enemy steel, a realization was beginning to sink in: this mechanical monster wasn't built for endurance. It was built for brute power, at a terrible cost. Dawson eased off the throttle, watching the gauge continue to sink as if mocking him. "Lieutenant," he said quietly. "We might have just captured the thirstiest damn thing in Europe." Miller folded his arms, eyes narrowing as the sound of the engine rumbled into the distance. "Let's find out just how thirsty." The platoon halted for lunch near a crossroads. The Sd.Kfz 7 idled beside them, its low growl echoing through the valley. Within an hour, 2 more fuel cans were empty. The men laughed about it at first, until they realized their own supply trucks were lagging far behind. The novelty was wearing off fast. But curiosity still burned in Red's eyes. "Let me take her up the ridge, sir. Just to see what she can do." Miller hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. But keep it short. We're not turning into the damn Wehrmacht trying to feed that thing." As Dawson revved the massive Maybach once more, no one could have guessed that this simple joyride, born out of curiosity and bravado, would become a field lesson in the brutal economics of German engineering. Fuel lines, logistics, and mechanical ambition, all colliding in one captured machine that symbolized both the brilliance and the downfall of the Third Reich's war machine. And as the Sd.Kfz thundered up the ridge, the sound of its roaring engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a group of American soldiers shaking their heads, realizing they'd found a prize that might cost them more than it was worth. By mid-afternoon, the captured Sd.Kfz sat parked beside a hedgerow, its hood still radiating heat, the smell of hot metal and exhaust heavy in the air. Corporal Dawson leaned back in the driver's seat, helmet pushed up on his forehead, staring at the nearly empty fuel gauge with disbelief. "Sir," he called down, "she's dry again. I swear I just filled her 20 minutes ago." Lieutenant Miller climbed up onto the running board, scanning the massive Maybach engine through the vents. "What's the mileage?" Dawson gave a hollow laugh. "Mileage? Sir, this thing drinks gas. Doesn't use it." He slapped the dashboard. "I've seen jeeps cross half of France on what this hog gulps in an hour." Private Sanders walked up carrying a clipboard, scribbling figures as he spoke. "I did the math, Lieutenant. Based on what we've poured in since this morning, she's burning over 2 gallons a mile." Miller blinked. 2 gallons? "Yes, sir," Sanders said, nodding grimly. "And that's on level ground." The men groaned. A few of them laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Across the field, their trusty M3 half-tracks sat lined up, their engines humming steadily. Each one could haul a squad of men and gear across miles of countryside on a fraction of the fuel this German monster required. Sergeant Walters spat into the mud. "No wonder the Krauts are walking back to Berlin. They probably ran out of gas halfway there." The comment drew chuckles, but the truth in it stung. Miller turned to the men. "All right. Drain what's left from the supply cans. I want a full test before we report this." An hour later, they had enough fuel to give the Sd.Kfz another run. Dawson fired it up again, the Maybach roaring like a caged lion. He pushed it across the open field. The sheer torque of the machine was incredible. It tore through soft earth, climbing inclines the M3 would have struggled with. Its traction was flawless. Its engineering, magnificent. But every roar of the engine sounded like the slurp of a thirsty animal. By the time Dawson turned back, the last of the fuel was gone. He coasted to a stop beside the M3S and jumped down, wiping sweat from his brow. "She's a beauty," he admitted. "But she'll bleed you dry." Sanders knelt beside the front fender, running a hand over the thick steel and intricate suspension. "Guess it makes sense. The Germans built this to tow the 88s. You need muscle for that kind of job." "Yeah," said Dawson. "But they paid for it in gas." The men stood quietly for a moment, the only sounds the distant drone of other engines and the soft creak of leather gear. Miller finally broke the silence. "This thing's a perfect symbol of their whole army. Overbuilt, overengineered, overcomplicated, and unsustainable." He turned toward his men. "Get a report ready for battalion. Tell M we've captured an Sd.Kfz in working order. But tell M not to expect to drive it far unless they've got a tanker convoy behind it." The squad burst into quiet laughter, the tension easing for a moment. But as the sun began to dip behind the hills, the platoon faced a decision: leave the beast where it sat, or try to haul it back to base for study. Miller chose the latter. It was, after all, a piece of German engineering worth examining. That night, they hitched the Sd.Kfz to one of their M3s, dragging it slowly toward camp. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, an American half-track pulling a German one. "Looks like the tables have turned," Sanders muttered. As the convoy crawled along the darkening road, the Sd. Sd.Kfz steel tracks clattered against the dirt, echoing off the trees like distant thunder. In the glow of their headlights, it looked almost ghostly, a relic of the Reich, proud but broken, its power wasted by a war that demanded too much from men and machines alike. By the time they reached camp, the engine had cooled, but its lesson burned hot in their minds: power meant nothing without endurance. For the rest of that week, the Sd.Kfz became an object of fascination. Engineers poked and prodded its Maybach engine, taking notes, measuring the monstrous fuel lines, trying to understand how such a marvel could also be such a liability. To the Americans, it was proof that Germany's obsession with mechanical superiority had come at a terrible cost, not just in resources, but in practicality. And as the war drew to a close, that captured half-track would stand as a quiet metaphor in the muddy fields of Germany, a monument to brilliance undone by excess. But the story didn't end there. Because days later, Red Dawson would decide to take it for one more run, and what happened next would make the platoon remember the Krauts gas hog for the rest of their lives. April 22, 1945. U.S. Forward Operating Camp, near Göttingen, Germany. Morning frost still clung to the ground when Corporal Jack Red Dawson wandered out from his tent, mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. The camp was waking up slowly, the faint clatter of mess tins, the cough of idling engines, the distant bark of a sergeant getting his men moving. And there it was again, the Sd.Kfz. Parked just beyond the maintenance line, its dull gray armor gleamed faintly in the pale sunlight. Its German markings had been crudely painted over with white stars, though the Iron Cross still faintly showed beneath. To Dawson, it was irresistible. He walked over and ran his hand across the fender. "You and me again, huh?" he muttered with a grin. Lieutenant Miller had left strict orders that no one was to waste fuel on souvenir joyrides. But Red Dawson wasn't planning on a joyride, not exactly. He just wanted to move it a little, maybe take it down the road for a systems check. For the record. And maybe, he thought, to feel that engine roar one last time. He spotted Private Sanders hunched over a fuel drum nearby. "Hey, Earl. You think command's gonna miss half a jerrycan?" Sanders squinted, already knowing where this was going. "Red, you're out of your damn mind. That thing's a fuel sponge. Come on, just enough to stretch her legs. One lap up the road and back." Sanders sighed. "You got a death wish, Corporal." But he helped anyway. That was the thing about soldiers near the end of a war: after months of chaos, fear, and exhaustion, sometimes a reckless act felt almost normal. They poured in about 10 gallons, maybe less. Dawson climbed into the driver's seat, flipped the ignition, and pressed the starter. The Maybach HL-62 came alive with a deafening growl, coughing black smoke before settling into a steady, thunderous purr. Heads turned all across camp. Lieutenant Miller stepped out of the command tent, hands on hips. "God damn it, Dawson," he shouted over the roar. But by then, Red was already in gear. The Sd.Kfz lurched forward, tearing across the muddy path that led toward the ridge road. The sound of the German engine echoed through the valley, deep, proud, and unmistakable. Miller cursed under his breath, signaling to a nearby jeep. "Let's go after him before he drives that thing straight to Berlin." Dawson, meanwhile, was grinning ear to ear. The half-track thundered over the uneven ground, mud sprang from its treads. For a moment, it felt like freedom, a raw connection between man and machine, the enemy's finest engineering under American hands. But the illusion didn't last long. A mile up the road, the Sd.Kfz began to sputter. The deep growl faded into a ragged cough. Red frowned, checked the gauges, and realized, impossibly, that the tank was already empty. He slammed the dashboard. "You gotta be kidding me." The Maybach gave one final, shuddering roar before dying completely. Silence fell over the forested road. Moments later, the jeep skidded to a halt beside him. Miller jumped out, face red with fury. Dawson. You got any idea how much gas you just wasted? Red held up his hands defensively. Sir, I was checking the what? Miller barked. You were checking how fast it could drink 10 gallons of fuel. Sanders, riding shotgun in the Jeep, couldn't help but laugh. Guess you found out, sir. About half a mile to the gallon, give or take. Even Miller cracked a reluctant smile. Hell, that's probably generous. They stood there for a moment, staring at the silent beast. Its long frame loomed against the tree line, beautiful, menacing, and utterly impractical. Finally, Miller shook his head. Hook it to the Jeep. We'll tow it back, again. As the chain clanked and the Sd.Kfz 7 was dragged back toward camp, Dawson leaned against the fender, watching the trees roll by. You know, he said, if the Krauts had figured out how to make this thing run on air, they might have won the damn war. Miller chuckled. If they'd built 10,000 more like it, they would have run out of gas before D-Day. When they returned, the Sd.Kfz 7 was parked at the edge of the camp, its engine now cold for good. The mechanic scrawled "Do not operate, fuel exhaustion hazard" across its hood in chalk. For the next few weeks, it became a quiet curiosity. Men posed for photos with it, engineers studied it, and fuel officers shook their heads whenever they walked by. But for Dawson's squad, it had become something more, a lesson carved in steel. The Sd.Kfz 7 was a masterpiece of design, but a monument to inefficiency. A symbol of German engineering brilliance strangled by its own complexity. And in the end, it sat idle, like the Reich it once served, powerful, impressive, and utterly defeated by its own ambition. In the final days of the war, when the 3rd Armored Division rolled deeper into Germany, the Sd.Kfz 7 remained behind. No one had the fuel to bring it. It rusted slowly in the rain, its tires sinking into the mud, its insignia fading under the weather. A relic of a war that had pushed machines, and men, far beyond their limits. May 1945. Just outside Göttingen, Germany. The war in Europe was all but over. The air was different now, quieter, heavier, filled with the weary calm of men who'd seen too much. The 3rd Armored's camp had become less a forward base and more a waiting ground for orders, for home, for news of peace. But one thing still sat exactly where they'd left it, the captured Sd.Kfz 7. The machine hadn't moved in weeks. Its once proud German grey had dulled under rain and dust. The white star hastily painted by U.S. mechanics was now streaked with grime. Its tracks were half buried in mud. A symbol of Germany's power and folly, slowly sinking into the very earth it had once rolled over with unstoppable confidence. Lieutenant Miller stood beside it one morning, clipboard in hand, as 2 ordnance officers from higher command walked slow circles around the vehicle, muttering in low tones. Impressive, isn't it? One said. 8 tons of pure torque. Tows an 88 like it's a toy. Yeah, the other replied, kicking a tire. But you'd need a convoy of tankers just to keep it moving. Miller couldn't help but smile faintly. You're not wrong, sir. We found that out the hard way. The officers took notes, peered into the engine bay, and eventually moved on, leaving the lieutenant alone with the great hulk of German steel. Behind him, Corporal Dawson and Private Sanders approached, hands in their pockets, coffee steaming in tin cups. Still here, huh? Dawson said. Kinda feels wrong, leavin' it like that. Miller nodded. It's not our job to save it. They'll probably ship it back to Aberdeen for testing. Or scrap it. Sanders smirked. Bet the eggheads'll figure out it burns more gas than a destroyer. Probably, Miller said. But that's not the part that matters. He placed a hand on the side of the Sd.Kfz 7, the cold metal slick with dew. This thing tells a story. About how Germany fought its war, with precision, with pride, but without sense. They built machines to impress, not to endure. And that's why they lost. The others fell silent. The truth of it hung in the still air. Dawson finally broke it. Still, you gotta hand it to M. Damn thing ran smoother than anything we've got. Miller nodded slowly. Yeah. Until it ran out of gas. They laughed quietly, the sound thin and tired, but genuine. Later that afternoon, as the platoon packed up their camp to move east toward Leipzig, Dawson lingered by the Sd.Kfz 7 one last time. He ran a hand along the fender, feeling the grooves and bullet pockmarks. He thought about all the fuel they'd poured into it, the hours they'd wasted trying to keep it running, and the absurdity of it all, men fighting a world war with machines that devoured more fuel than the men had strength to carry. Hell of a ride, old girl, he murmured. But you never stood a chance. When the convoy rolled out, the Sd.Kfz 7 was left behind, half-shadowed under a line of trees, its massive form fading into the mist. Birds perched on its treads, and rain began to fall again, soft, steady, cleansing. Weeks later, a reconnaissance team passing through the same area found it just as they had left it. The tires were flat, the engine seized, moss already growing along the chassis. To them, it was just another abandoned German vehicle among thousands. But for the men of the 3rd Armored, it had been something else entirely, a mirror held up to the enemy's strength and its fatal weakness. Years later, long after the war, the Sd.Kfz 7 would find a new life in museums and documentaries. Historians would marvel at its design, engineers would praise its mechanics, and collectors would chase surviving examples across Europe. But those who'd seen one in the mud, those who'd driven it, cursed it, and dragged it behind their jeeps, they remembered something different. They remembered the sound of the Maybach engine roaring like thunder, the feel of the whole vehicle trembling with power, and the sinking feeling that came when the fuel gauge dropped faster than the road beneath them. To the GIs who drove it, the Sd.Kfz 7 was more than just a machine. It was a lesson written in oil and steel, that power without endurance, brilliance without practicality, will always burn itself out. And in that final spring of 1945, as the fires of war began to die, so too did the engine of Germany's great machine, sputtering to a stop, out of gas, out of time.